3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
All action.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
All right, we are live in front of the Supreme Court, where the U.S. Supreme Court has just released its decision on the case Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. You can see the crowd behind me. It's getting wild, it's getting loud. There's a lot of energy in this crowd.
The culture of death that has just been lifted off of our nation, and we are now a culture of life again. And I am just so, we're in the middle of praying right when they announced it. So I'm just so grateful to God.
This month marks the third anniversary of the Dobbs decision. It overturned the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which used the right to privacy under the 14th Amendment as justification to create a constitutional right to abortion. Dobbs fixed that mistake and protected unborn children across the country. Now, as ever, the decisions of the Supreme Court reverberate throughout the nation, defining the limits of government power and often directing our culture. The 2024-2025 term of the Supreme Court is now coming to a close, bringing with it a wide range of cases, some of which have yet to be decided. Here to talk about what has happened this year and what we might expect to see over the next week is Heritage Senior Legal Fellow Hans von Spakovsky. All right, Hans von Spakovsky, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Well, you're a glutton for punishment since you invited me back.
Well, for folks who have not gotten enough of Hans, on his podcast, the Case in Point podcast, which is the legal show for regular people done here at the Heritage Foundation, we have you here this week on Heritage Explains to join us and talk about the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. We're coming to the end of this past year's term.
Right.
And there have been a lot of wins for conservatives. There are a few more decisions that will be coming down this year. So we want to talk about some of the highlights, some of the things that have happened this past year, especially vis-a-vis the Trump administration.
Let me divide this into two areas. I mean, one is the substantive decisions that have come down. And as you said, Mark, we've had some pretty good decisions. One case out of Ohio, great case. A woman sued the state of Ohio. She was a state employee saying, I was discriminated against because I'm not gay. It's kind of reverse discrimination. And the lower courts imposed a higher standard of proof on her than if she'd been gay, basically saying, well, because you're a heterosexual and therefore you're part of the majority, you got a higher standard of proof. Supreme Court unanimously said, no, the same standard of proof applies in any kind of discrimination case like that. Very, very good, very fair decision and an easy decision because of the way the statute's written. Another great case for the Second Amendment and frankly gun owners across the country is the fact that the government of Mexico sued what I call the Seven Sisters, the seven major gun companies in America. The name party was Smith & Wesson, but in essence, Mexico sued saying you're responsible for all the violence, criminal violence in Mexico. And the Supreme Court came back again unanimously and said, no, there's a federal statute that bars that kind of liability. You cannot sue. This was actually a great example of the Mexican government trying to blame somebody else for the fact that it can't do anything about the cartel violence down there. Another terrific win was a case involving Catholic charities. The state of Wisconsin refused to give them a tax exemption that goes to church organizations because they said, well, basically they said you're not churchy enough in your charitable work. For example, when you're helping poor people, you don't proselytize. You don't try to convert them. And, obviously the state doesn't understand Catholicism since it's part of the creed. It's part of the beliefs that you should help people regardless of who they are and what their potential religious beliefs are. And again, Supreme Court came in and said, you can't do that. You can't make that kind of, the state cannot make that kind of a judgment on a church or religious organization. All good. Now, not quite as important, but something that will make people feel good is they ruled in favor of a family whose house was mistakenly destroyed by an FBI SWAT raid that went wrong. They went to the wrong place. And the government, federal government, refused to pay for it, saying, we're immune, can't make us pay it. And the Supreme Court came back and said, no, this fits with one of the exceptions to what's called the Federal Tort Claims Act. And yes, you can sue the government for the damages they caused to your home. Given how often in this country, people are now experiencing this kind of thing because cranks or people who don't like them politically will call and the police will show up mistakenly because of that. That's actually a good thing. Of course, we also got a really important decision, U.S. versus Scrimeti. That was out of Tennessee. Tennessee passed, frankly, a law to protect kids, and it was followed by about 24 other states saying you cannot engage in what folks try to call it gender affirming care. No, what they said was you can't engage in basically surgical mutilation and abusive drug treatments to try to make someone look like a different gender. And the ACLU sued, and again, the Supreme Court said, no, that's within the protective authority of a state to protect minors under something like that. All very good decisions.
For those folks who might want to know more about the Scrimeti case, you had the opportunity to interview Mr. Scrimeti on Case in Point a few months ago.
Well, it was actually the solicitor. Scrimeti is the Attorney General of Tennessee. But the case was argued by his Solicitor General, a guy named Matt Rice, and I interviewed him about it. That was his first argument before the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won.
And that interview will be out this week, so you'll be able to check it out here at Case in Point.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I talked about there's different sets of decisions. The other thing that's been really more active than usual is what they call the emergency docket. The emergency docket is when the Supreme Court isn't making substantive decisions the way it did in these cases, but they have gotten a lot of emergency appeals filed by the Trump administration because of these nationwide injunctions that have been issued all over the country. In fact, just this past Monday, Supreme Court issued an emergency stay of an injunction that had been issued by a judge in Massachusetts. Folks will recall that the Trump administration detained and removed a whole passel of illegal alien criminals. I mean, child rapists, murderers, et cetera, and took them to Sudan, even though they're not originally from Sudan. And this judge said, you can't do that, and issued an injunction. Supreme Court just issued a decision staying that injunction, which means basically suspending it, which means that the Trump administration can restart deporting aliens to third countries. In other words, not the country that is the native country of that alien. So that's the kind of emergency appeals that we've been getting, and the Trump administration has been pretty good at winning those.
What is the state overall of a lot of these injunctions? I mean, do you expect that we'll continue to see the Supreme Court challenge them? Do you think it's going to be a mixed bag? What's the state of play there?
Well, next week is going to be the final week of the Supreme Court's term. The end of June is when the term ends, and all the justices get out of town for the summer. Okay, we have a bunch of important decisions that we're still waiting on, including a case involving pornography out of Texas, a case involving a school board in Maryland where they refused to let parents opt their kids out of gender propaganda and DEI education. But one of the other cases we're waiting for that's important to this is a case on birthright citizenship. Now, The substantive issue is not before the court. The court is not going to decide whether or not President Trump's interpretation of birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment is correct or not. What's up before the court, again, is part of this emergency docket. DOJ filed an emergency appeal asking the court to stay or suspend 3 nationwide injunctions that have been issued by 3 different judges in 3 different courts. That's what the fight is about. And what frankly, a lot of people are hoping, including me, is that when the Supreme Court issues its decision in that case, it will issue very strict rules on nationwide injunctions in general, not just in this case, but in general, that will hopefully restrict judges from issuing these all over the country.
You mentioned that several of the cases, including some of those released most recently, were unanimous. One of the narratives that we see kind of played out is that, this is really Trump's Supreme Court. This is really a partisan court. This is illegitimate. We need to have more Supreme Court justices, those sorts of things. Based on what you've seen this term, is this a divided or partisan or compromised Supreme Court?
Well, look, just a week or so ago, we had one unanimous decision after another. And even in the cases that weren't unanimous, we had some strange combinations, of a liberal and generally conservative justice, for example, dissenting. The place you see the divide are in the cases over immigration and over what are considered social issues. So like the Scrimeti case, the case involving transgender treatments. Yeah, that was 6-3. The stay that was just issued stopping that injunction against the removal of criminal aliens, third countries, that was 6-3. So immigration, transgender issues, things like that, then you get a split. But in a lot of the other cases, you don't get that kind of a split. And I think that says a lot about the court and anybody who thinks it always divides up between the liberal justices on the court and those who are generally considered conservative, obviously haven't looked at the record of the court.
So obviously this term of the Supreme Court is going to wrap up in June. The next one will start in October. As you look forward, is there anything that you might expect to see coming down the pike?
Well, back to the emergency docket. We've had one immigration case after another. We've had one case after another involving what the president has been doing and trying to lay off federal employees, what DOJ has been doing. Many of those have gotten Supreme Court, but only on an emergency basis where the Trump administration is asking for a stay of a nationwide injunction issued by a lower court judge. Those cases are going to work their way through the courts and finally get back to the Supreme Court on these substantive issues. Did the president, for example, does he have the power to lay off lots of employees in particular departments? I expect those cases probably will work their way through the summer while the Supreme Court is off at the lower courts, the district courts, courts of appeal, and they will start arriving at the court when the new term starts, which is October of this year. Also, the other case that's sure to be back is birthright citizenship. But this time, not just on the nationwide injunctions, but on the substantive question of how do you interpret the 14th Amendment on that?
Hans von Spakovsky, thanks for being back on the show.
Well, Mark, thanks for having me back.
Thanks to Hans von Spakovsky for his contribution to today's episode. You can follow Hans on X at @HvonSpakovsky, and you can listen to his podcast, Case in Point, at the link in the show notes. And thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.